Okay, so I'm Philip Taubman. I worked for 30 years as an editor and reporter at the New York Times, including periods as Washington bureau chief and Moscow bureau chief. I'm now at Stanford University as a consulting professor at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, where I spend my time working on book projects. Well, once we learned what had happened, I think it's fair to say it was the most extraordinary meeting of the Cold War between Soviet and American leaders. They actually discussed briefly, but they nevertheless discussed the abolition of nuclear weapons in Reykjavik, which was something Reagan had favored for some time. Gorbachev was willing to entertain the idea. Even beyond that, most people don't recall, they had a long and very serious discussion about elimination of ballistic missiles, which is the primary means of delivering nuclear weapons. So the summit was really way out of the mainstream in terms of the kinds of ambitious agreements they were talking about. It was the moment, I think, if you look back at history, in which Gorbachev really moved the Soviet Union out of its kind of Cold War static positions, implacable, immovable, to a position much closer to where the United States was. And even though they didn't reach agreement there, and there was a lot of confusion afterward as to what exactly had happened, Reykjavik was really the moment that paved the way to a whole new style of arms control agreements, actual reductions of nuclear weapons, rather than just putting a ceiling on the limits that you could reach. So it was a historically extraordinarily important moment. Well, we've come a long way in terms of reductions, not nearly far enough, but Reykjavik was the first step towards arms reduction agreements, of which there have been a series. So at the height of the Cold War, not just about the time those leaders met in Reykjavik, the United States and Soviet Union together had 70,000 nuclear warheads. I mean, it's a preposterous number when you think about it. It's enough to annihilate the planet. We're now down to about 20,000, 22,000, so that's a big reduction. There's still, too many. I don't think the United States has a use for all the weapons it has. It has, under the New START agreement, it's going to have 1,550 operational warheads, and there are an additional 5,000 in reserve. The Russians have more than that. So Reykjavik opened the way to arms reductions, but then things slowed down, and while the US and Russia were reducing and some countries were eliminating nuclear weapons like Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, which after the fall of the Soviet Union ended up with big nuclear arsenals, they gave them up. But meantime, Pakistan developed nuclear weapons, India built an arsenal of nuclear weapons, North Korea has nuclear weapons, Iran is working on a nuclear weapons program, it seems. So the balance, it looked kind of promising for a while, and then it sort of tipped in the wrong direction. And so we are at a kind of tipping point now where nuclear proliferation is a really dangerous issue. What concerns me, and a lot of people, I think including President Obama, is not a global nuclear war. That threat is over. What is really scary today is the idea of a nuclear 9/11. Terrorist group getting its hands on either a weapon or the material to make one and introducing it into New York or London or Moscow or Tokyo, you name it, detonating it. The world will not be the same after that. So that's the threat today, more than a Russian-American nuclear exchange. That's not going to happen. Well, we have to do everything we can, and fortunately I think the American government under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, so it's been a bipartisan effort, something unusual these days. The American government is working to try to prevent proliferation in partnership with the Russian government. It's an area where there's been a great deal of cooperation. We're rounding up a lot of vulnerable bomb-grade fissile material that's spread around the world. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union gave away tons of highly enriched uranium to try to win allies and friends by giving them research reactors that were fueled with this material. That's the ingredient that goes into a nuclear weapon. So we're trying to roll that up. That's the most important thing we're trying to do. We have to bring down the number of weapons we have. The Russians have to bring down the number. If we could get both countries down below 1,000, it's not inconceivable, then you might be able to get other nuclear weapon states to start thinking about some agreement to reduce the numbers even further in a kind of global agreement. Will we ever get to zero? I doubt it. But it's certainly a goal that's worth talking about. And I think it's encouraging that President Obama is committed to that. And, you know, maybe people will write it off as rhetoric and not real reality. But at a meeting of the Security Council at the United Nations 3 years ago, the leaders of the 15 members of the Security Council, and they were all represented by their heads of state, including President Obama, and at the time President Medvedev of Russia, they all agreed to try to eliminate nuclear weapons. Well, they go hand in hand. On one hand, the challenge is reducing the number of nuclear weapons that exist, and they're 20 plus thousand, 90% controlled by the United States and Russia. So the first thing you have to do on the weapons side is to get the United States and Russia to bring their numbers way down. The New START agreement brings them down, but it's still a high number, 1,550 operational warheads and thousands of warheads in reserve. There's really no limit on the reserve number. The rest of the world isn't going to talk about reducing weapons, those states that have them, like China and India and other nations with nuclear weapons, until Russia and China get down to, Russia and the United States get down to a low level. If we're still up there, it's like a chain smoker, telling people to stop smoking. It's not a credible argument to make. So that's on the weapons side. Then on the proliferation side, the materials are incredibly important because it's complicated to make a uranium bomb, but it is not so complicated that a terror group would be unable to do so. The hardest thing to do is to get the highly enriched uranium. They can't make it. It's a big industrial process. There's tons of it sitting around in Russia, in the United States, in Pakistan, and other countries around the world that received this material during the Cold War through programs that the Soviet Union and the United States sponsored. The American program is called Atoms for Peace. We're now rolling that up. We're doing the best we can to try to make that secure and safe, but there's still a lot out there. So the danger today is that a terror group will make a weapon and then use it. So the proliferation side, in some ways, is more urgent than the reduction in weapons side. Because both countries, I'm afraid the United States and Russia, are locked in a Cold War mindset about nuclear deterrence. It's very difficult because the mindset, behind the mindset, are vast institutional interests in both countries that are invested in our nuclear weapons complex. We're all these national labs that are expensive to operate. The weapon systems that go to deliver America's nuclear weapons, if we were ever to use them, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles, the airplanes that we might still rely on. Maybe someday we'll be delivering nuclear weapons by drones. There is a lot of vested interests in maintaining the Cold War mindset because the Cold War mindset brings with it a big nuclear industrial complex that's expensive to operate. And I'm not an advocate of abandoning that complex. What I think needs to happen is to bring it down to a scale commensurate with the threats we face today. And it's very hard to get that kind of thing done in Washington these days. I think on reductions, we might actually consider something fairly radical, which, by the way, Richard Pearl, who was one of the chief arms control nuclear weapons experts in the Reagan administration, agrees with me on this, that maybe it's time for the United States to do some unilateral cuts not worry about the Russian arsenal, just bring our arsenal down to a level that we think is sufficient for us. Let the Russians make their own decisions. They're bound to make some reductions too, and not try to codify these in a treaty, because right now the conditions for, one, negotiating a treaty are very difficult between the two nations, and secondly, getting it ratified in the United States Senate is going to be very difficult. So on the weapons side, it might be possible to reduce. At some point, if you want to go to zero, you want to abolish nuclear weapons, then you're going to need some kind of international agreement. And by the way, you know, it's way over time that the United States should approve the, you know, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The Senate rejected that in the Clinton administration. There are not the votes today to pass it. I hope that will change at some point, because that goes hand in hand with reducing weapons, is to get that treaty into force.